So, Pan Africanism as we know it today is not the most relevant way we can use to talk about Africa as a continent. I mean, for example, many people still view Africa as a country, even though it's a continent of 54 countries with a population of over 1 billion people, it being the most culturally and literally every way you could think about diverse continent in the world. But Pan-Africanism as itself needs to change. A lot of our Pan-Africanism ideals are related to the 20th century and not necessarily today. So what I wanted to share with you guys today is a research paper that I read and dissected, and I thought it was very interesting because it talks a lot about how our Pan-Africanism perspective needs to change with the changing times. For example, what I find really interesting in this paper is that it highlights how the biggest win for Africa in terms of decolonization, which was South Africa's end of apartheid, also ironically marked almost like the beginning of the end, the beginning of basically late stage capitalism in the African continent. As we see with the end of apartheid and decolonization and a lot of countries gaining independence, ironically, these countries' leaders who are often very upper class Africans tend to want to embrace free markets and very neoliberal policies, which only further the poverty, further economic disparities, and doesn't really help at all. So I just thought this paper was very interesting. It also highlights another very interesting aspect of decolonization within the African continent, and it talks about how slavery is still something that is heavily practiced throughout the African continent. For example, in Mauritania, slavery is still practiced. It was only outlawed in the 80s, but it's still informally practiced, and African Union is aware of the fact that slavery is still a normal thing. It's still a daily thing that happens within Mauritania, but they kind of just ignore it, and they do sort of link it to the original Pan-African ideals. You know, slavery was the ending of slavery was such a big one, so to see like a country still practicing it is just completely absurd. And how African countries don't really try to decolonize it in any way, they kind of just turn a blind eye. And it's not just Mauritania. In Libya, the slave trade is still heavily practiced, emphasis on the heavy. Trafficking oftentimes Black Africans into slave trades. There are slave markets. I'm sure you guys have seen many people talking about it on social media. And then there's also, not to mention, slavery in Congo, which is what I think is personally is slavery, working for minerals, working for digging for cobalt, often done by children and women, getting paid barely nothing, and it's just horrible. And all of this to say, this doesn't even include sexual slavery, which is in pretty much every country in Africa. But it's not just limited to Africa, it's limited. Every country in the world has some form of sexual slavery or sex trade, but in Africa, it's very prolific. So all of this to say, our perception of Pan-Africanism needs to change. And it also kind of does highlight where the diaspora falls into this, and how many African leaders see the diaspora as more of an economic tool than a cultural or social one, meaning that they try to emphasize travel to the African continent. And this is the African diaspora. So these are Africans living outside of Africa, and then this includes African Americans, Afro Caribbeans, Afro Latinos, or anyone of just African descent. And a lot of countries try to bring these African diasporic people to spend money for tourism and everything, but it also just kind of perpetuates gentrification. It perpetuates more economic disparity with the Africans who are living there. So all of this to say, it is just not helpful. But anyway, I just found this article very interesting, and yeah, I just wanted to share my thoughts. So yeah.